Just ask you to introduce yourself.
Michael Smart, Rock Creek Global Advisors. I'm going to try to put a fine point on something that the three of you seem to agree on. Nancy, I agree with what you said in response to Shawn's question to the SG. The trade policy has already changed very significantly. If you look at, let's keep it in the US context of TPP, and you look at the labor and environment chapter, how holistic that agreement is, adherence to ILO fundamental rights at work and adherence to international environmental agreements. Very significant changes. So if you put that into the political context, I think what I hear the three of you saying is that when it comes to strictly trade policy, it has adapted and it is significantly different and has addressed some of the concerns that have been raised. Why we're falling short and why the debate is continuing to be quite negative is because of these other areas, whether it's retirement security or education or healthcare, et cetera. Do each of you agree that that's essentially where we are today?
I certainly do. I mean, I think, I don't want to defend my boss, he can defend himself, but I think he was sort of answering a different question. Is there something that's fundamentally changed that alters the view of open markets providing more benefits than any known alternative or any unknown alternative? The answer is that there's no fundamental change. I think that's where he was coming from. I mean, the TPP has 30 chapters. It's a trade agreement plus, isn't it? There's an awful lot in there that perhaps is a signal of where trade and related economic policy and social policy is going in the future. I mean, I'll give the mic to Nancy, but I just wanted to, we're having a conversation about trade and it seems to be focused on agreements and things that countries negotiated. I mean, one of the other elements that we're advocating very strongly on a bilateral basis, but also in the G20, for example, is that trade and investment policies are one part of an economic policy toolkit. It's a part of structural policy reform. So you can negotiate away policies that are ineffective at home, or you could improve them at home. So what the SG referred to as unilateral disarmament is a bit of a odd expression perhaps, but the notion that trade openness can be a part of and can be sequenced along with complementary social and economic policies is something that I think we need to come back to. It doesn't all need to happen in Geneva or other places.
Nancy?
So do we basically agree? So what I would like to say is I'm the full agenda of the American labor movement around how to deal with the impacts of trade. I'm not saying I'm speaking for that because it would be too simple just to say yes. But the fundamental issue of how do we manage, how does a country like the US manage the distribution issue, the unfairness and the lack of access. And I want to say, I think we know now that technology is at least as impactful and soon will be more than many trade agreements and trade situations. And many boring jobs are going to disappear. And so that challenge for our society, maybe this is a good time in relationship to trade. How do we work as a society and how do we anticipate the change technology is bringing so we can make the most out of it and we can avoid the worst things? I think we are in agreement on that, I think. And it needs to ripen. And the voice of business, thinking about that, you all know and have solved a lot of problems along the way. So the voice of business in this, having an interest and having a practical approach could make a big difference in moving along, broadening the discussion of how we work with winners and losers. And I'm not saying people are losers, but sometimes people lose jobs or their jobs are threatened.
Yeah. The voice of business has been cited there. That brings it to you.
Well, as I listened to Michael's question, I mean, obviously the trade agreements have gone a long way in the last 25 years in terms of covering things that didn't cover before. Now that seems to me a bit of a double-edged sword here that, do we create expectations that everything can be fixed through trade agreements here, which I don't think we can. I think, as you pointed out, there's a lot of other issues out there. Ken was saying the same thing, different way, that we just can't solve all those problems in Geneva. I can't sell much in Geneva right now, but you know, so I think that we do, you know, and that's why I was talking about competitiveness issues. We've been talking about these from a different, usually we weren't talking about those always in a trade agenda. You know, we were talking about those in terms of, you know, each country needs to be thinking, what do they have to be doing to adapt here? I mean, when I talk to a lot of speaking in international groups, I talk about global value change, the extent to which businesses have changed the way they do business, and that comes back to Ken's, you know, and the Secretary General's point about the unilateral. I mean, I try to emphasize that when you have products now that are made in 10 different countries that are, you know, moving back and forth, intermediate goods are moving back and forth, every import duty is a tax on that product and raising the cost of that product. So it's a different business environment. The trade policy issues are different, but and there are the issues outside of trade that are all factoring into, I think, what Ken was describing as, you know, an economic policy has to be kind of holistic. It can't be just about trade. It has to be about these other elements of, you know, education and training and skills and infrastructure and all these other pieces that are going to be part of whether you're going to have an economy that is growing, whether your businesses are able to flourish, whether entrepreneurs are able to grow and develop. And but an important part of that is, you know, as we often say, our companies, the market for a lot of our companies is outside the United States, so they have to be able to access those markets. That's why trade investment, then we come back to that as a key part of the growth that is needed as an essential element of inclusive growth.
But there's also clearly, if you look out at the business landscape, there's the kind of conspiracy of technology, protectionism, existing trade agreements, consumer trends, natural disasters, all of which are affected business trends. Jeff Immelt a couple weeks ago at NYU gave this fascinating speech in which he talked about GE switching to a strategy of localization, which was fascinating because he's saying, look, we just don't see the globalization play anymore. We think we have a which is exactly, I shook my head when I read it as well. But you see an amazing moment when you see people like that deciding to move factories closer to market, to take advantage of trade agreements, but also to get around trade barriers, to get closer to market. I was in Ohio during the primary campaign up there, and probably the most interesting factory I visited in a while was a place called Fuyao Glass in America, which is a Chinese auto glass company, which is now building the world's largest auto glass factory, not in China somewhere, but near Dayton, Ohio. And you go onto that line, and it is largely automated. There's 4 or 5 people per line rather than the 25 or 30 you might see in China. The labor cost piece has been removed. They're much more interested in low energy costs in the US than they are in low labor costs in China in terms of production. And they look at something like the TPP and they say, well, we're just getting around it and we're moving closer to market, and so on. And I wonder if all of these global value chains and all these things that we've talked about are changing at the same time.